At 72, Miriam Watson, a widow, perched by her living room window, meticulously observed the serene suburban street outside. 4 years, Maple Street epitomized middle-class peace, but recently, something peculiar began to unfold. Each night, a sleek black car would silently coast down the road, vanishing into a run-down garage at the block's end. At its wheel sat James Harrow, a once revered black millionaire, now cloaked in enigma. Beside him, a young girl in a vibrant yellow dress, her gaze laden with untold secrets. As Miriam's gaze lingered, her curiosity morphed into worry. Why was James Harrow, a man celebrated for his wealth and kindness, frequenting a deserted garage nightly with a child? What dark secrets were stirring beneath the calm of their once tranquil neighborhood? Don't forget to subscribe if you find this video intriguing, and let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Before we delve deeper into this tale of hidden motives, bravery, and twists, make sure to hit that subscribe button. In the heart of Brookvale, where the streets are lined with trees, the suburbs hummed with a quiet, steady rhythm. Homes, modest yet proud, displayed their manicured lawns, symbols of middle-class dreams. Here, everyone thought they knew each other's affairs. Amid this backdrop, an unusual scene captured the locals' attention every evening. As the sun set, casting shades of orange and purple across the sky, a polished vintage black car would gracefully make its way down Maple Street. James Harrow, the driver, appeared out of place amidst the simplicity of Brookvale. In his mid-30s, James's wealth and sophistication were unmistakable, his blue suit sharp and pristine, hinting at a life of corporate boardrooms and big deals rather than suburban quietude. However, it was not just James drawing the neighbors' eyes. Amara, a young girl, no older than 7 or 8, sat next to him, her bright yellow dress a vivid contrast to James's understated elegance. They always ended up at the same destination, a decrepit garage at the street's end, its faded paint and rusted door stark against the well-kept homes around it. As they approached, the garage door would creak open, engulfing the peculiar duo in shadows. From her window, Miriam Watson watched this enigmatic ritual with growing fascination and concern. At 72, Miriam was well known in the neighborhood, her vigilant eyes rarely missing the comings and goings along her street. Since her husband's death 3 years ago, she had become even more observant. Something about James's nightly visits seemed profoundly odd. Miriam recalled seeing him in the neighborhood years before, known for his philanthropy, his mansion a local legend of success. So, what brought him to this neglected garage night after night? And why with a child? These troubling questions gnawed at Miriam, keeping her awake long past when the garage's lights went out. Weeks passed, the routine unchanged. James and Amara would arrive as dusk fell, the girl's yellow dress a beacon in the dimming light, only to reappear at dawn. James, still impeccably dressed, would escort Amara back to the car, driving off as the neighborhood lay in whisper-filled wake. Miriam found herself glued to her window, her knitting abandoned, as she tried to decipher the nature of their mysterious visits. James interacted with no one, his expression unreadable, focused solely on guiding Amara to and from the garage. The girl seemed well cared for, her dress always neat, her hair perfectly braided, yet something in her eyes, a certain shadow, unsettled Miriam deeply. As the seasons shifted from summer to autumn, Miriam's concerns intensified. She imagined the worst, pondering if James was concealing something dire, if Amara was in danger. Though part of her wanted to dismiss these fears. After all, James had always been seen as benevolent. The secrecy and isolation surrounding their nightly excursions were too suspicious to overlook. Determined for answers, Miriam started making excuses to be outside as James's car arrived, watering plants, checking the mail, or taking casual strolls, all in hopes of getting a closer glimpse into the mystery that troubled her peaceful neighborhood. James was always on alert, his gaze sweeping the street as he hurriedly guided Amara into the garage. Miriam, no matter her efforts, couldn't get close enough to engage with either of them. As the leaves began to change, casting Brookvale in hues of red and gold, her neighbours started noticing her persistent vigil at the window. Mrs. Johnson next door remarked on Miriam's frequent presence by the glass, and Tom from across the street teased her about taking up bird-watching. However, Miriam met their curiosity with nothing more than a smile and a dismissive wave, keeping her deepening worries to herself. Inside, her mind buzzed with a storm of questions and speculations. Night after night she lay awake, replaying each observation, James's protective hand guiding Amara, the girl's subdued nature so unlike her peers, their elegant attire starkly contrasting with the run-down garage they frequented. Something was definitely amiss in Brookvale, and Miriam was certain of it. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, her resolve to uncover the truth only strengthened, unaware that her quest would soon challenge everything she believed about her tranquil neighbourhood and its residents. At the heart of the community, the Brookvale Community Centre was always bustling, a central spot where locals gathered to socialise and participate in various activities. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, as the weekly book club wrapped up, the centre hummed with its usual vibrancy. Miriam sat at one of the round tables, her hands clasping a mug of chamomile tea, surrounded by the familiar, jovial chatter of neighbours. Yet her mind was elsewhere, preoccupied with the enigma that had consumed her for weeks. As conversations flowed around her, Miriam found herself only half listening to Deb's lively story about her grandson's latest soccer game. Her gaze kept drifting to the large windows overlooking Maple Street, half expecting to see James's black car slide past, even though it was still hours before his usual arrival. Miriam, earth to Miriam, Deb's voice, filled with light amusement, finally pierced her reverie. Miriam blinked, refocusing on the group that included Debbie, Tom, a retired postal worker known for his corny jokes, Lisa, a young mother of two radiating tranquility amidst chaos, and a few other book club regulars. "Oh, I'm fine, dear," Miriam responded, her smile forced. "Just a bit distracted, I guess." "Distracted by what?" Tom leaned in, his interest piqued, a familiar glint in his eye. "You've got that look you used to have when you were plotting one of your neighbourhood watch crusades." Laughter rippled through the group, reminiscing about Miriam's fervent campaigns against everything from unleashed dogs to improper recycling habits. Miriam, however, didn't join in the laughter. She set down her teacup, her expression turning serious, her eyes sharpening with determination. "Actually," she started, her voice low but firm, "there is something that's been troubling me. I'm not sure if any of you have noticed, but recently we've noticed some odd happenings around here," Miriam began, capturing the group's attention as they leaned closer. With a deep breath, she braced herself for the irreversible step she was about to take. "It concerns James Harrow," she announced, noticing the flicker of recognition on their faces. "You all remember the wealthy businessman from the grand mansion up on the hill? Well, he's been appearing in our neighbourhood night after night for the last few months." "James Harrow?" Lisa echoed, her expression puzzled. "I thought I saw him driving down our street recently. But what's so unusual about that?" "He's been a community supporter for years, hasn't he?" Miriam nodded, her fingers tapping nervously on her teacup. "Yes, but it's not just a drive-through or his usual philanthropic visits. He's been spending each night in that old, abandoned garage at the end of Maple Street." A stunned silence enveloped the group before Tom finally whistled softly. "That is peculiar. What could a man like James Harrow possibly be doing in such a place? And there's more," Miriam added, lowering her voice even further. "He's not there alone. Every night, a little girl accompanies him. They arrive in his luxury car, enter the garage, and don't emerge until the next morning." The group reacted immediately. Debbie's eyes widened in shock, Tom whistled again, and Lisa furrowed her brow in deep thought. "A little girl?" Debbie repeated, her tone a mix of worry and intrigue. "How old?" "No more than 7 or 8, Miriam responded. "She's always in a bright yellow dress, a pretty little thing with dark curly hair." "And you're certain they stay there overnight?" Tom inquired, his usual humor replaced by concern. Miriam nodded firmly. "Absolutely. I've seen them go in at night and come out in the morning. They never interact with anyone else. It's as if they're hiding." The room fell silent as everyone processed the information, the weight of the implications hanging in the air. Breaking the silence, Lisa cautiously suggested, "It does sound unusual, but James has always been known for his charity. Perhaps he's assisting the girl's family in some way." Debbie agreed. "Exactly. Remember how he helped the Johnsons keep their house when Mr. Johnson was laid off? James has always been generous to those in need." "But in an abandoned garage? With a child?" Miriam pressed, frustration coloring her tone. "Doesn't that strike you as suspicious?" Tom shifted uneasily. "Now, Miriam, let's not jump to conclusions. James is a respected figure here. Why cast aspersions as if he's done something wrong?" A flicker of doubt crossed Miriam's mind, stirred by Tom's words, but the memory of the girl's haunting gaze fortified her resolve. "I'm not accusing him outright," she defended. "I'm just saying it's strange. Don't we have a duty to ensure everything is okay, especially concerning a child?" The group fell into an uneasy silence, their faces marked by hesitation and the reluctance to delve into potentially murky waters. Softly, Debbie reached out, touching Miriam's hand. "Miriam, I know you mean well, but are you sure you're not reading too much into this? Could it be that you're just looking for something to keep your mind occupied?" she suggested gently, leaving her question hanging in the air. Miriam understood the implication behind Debbie's words, suggesting that since her husband's death, she might be projecting her grief into the situation. "This has nothing to do with that," Miriam stated firmly, withdrawing her hand. "I know what I've seen. Something isn't right, and I thought you'd all want to be aware." Lisa leaned in, her voice gentle yet assertive. "Miriam, we understand your concern, but it's important we don't jump to conclusions. James has always been a pillar in this community. And the little girl, is it possible you're assuming something negative because she's black?" Miriam recoiled, shocked and hurt by the suggestion. "Of course not," she retorted sharply. "This has nothing to do with race. I'm concerned for a child who could be in trouble. That's all." All right, Tom interjected, raising his hands in a calming gesture. "Let's keep things peaceful here. Miriam, we hear you, but could it be a bit invasive, prying into James's private affairs? Wealthy people can have their quirks. Perhaps it's just a personal issue he prefers to keep private." Miriam scanned the faces around the table, feeling her heart sink as she met their skepticism and discomfort. She had hoped for their support, to share in her concern, yet she felt increasingly isolated, her worries either dismissed or worse, attributed to prejudice or loneliness. "Maybe you're right," she conceded quietly, her voice barely audible. "Perhaps I am overreacting." Debbie reached out again, this time successfully patting Miriam's hand. "It's good to be concerned, dear, but let's not turn this into more than it is. There's probably a reasonable explanation for everything." As the conversation shifted to other community topics like the upcoming fall festival, Lisa's daughter's dance recital, and the new downtown restaurant, Miriam felt disconnected, her tea growing cold. She remained seated as the meeting ended, watching her neighbors leave with laughter and chatter, starkly contrasting her inner turmoil. Lisa lingered, pausing by Miriam's chair. "Are you coming, Miriam?" she asked softly. Miriam forced a smile. "In a minute, dear. Go ahead." Once alone in the now silent community center, Miriam felt a resolve forming within her. Despite her neighbor's disbelief, and even accusations of paranoia or prejudice, she was convinced something was amiss. Determined, Miriam collected her things and stepped out into the crisp autumn air, her vigilance undeterred. She was resolved to unravel the mystery of James Harlow and the little girl in the yellow dress, regardless of what anyone else thought. Over the following days, as Miriam continued her routine, the chill of the autumn air seemed to mirror the growing cold isolation she felt. Even as she tended to her garden and prepared meals alone, her thoughts were fixated on James and Amara. The community's dismissal of her concerns shook her, causing her to question her observations. Yet, every evening, as James's car slid into the garage with Amara, her resolve hardened. One chilly evening, Miriam noticed new details that intensified her suspicions. James's suit was rumpled, and Amara's bright yellow dress appeared worn. "This isn't right," she muttered, anxiety mounting. She wondered who to confide in, as the neighborhood seemed to view her with skepticism and pity. Despite the whispers and the isolation, Miriam's determination only grew. If no one else was willing to see the truth, she was ready to uncover it alone, driven by a deep-seated conviction that something sinister was unfolding right under their noses. But this only strengthened her resolve. If there was even a slight chance that Amara was in danger, Miriam could not just sit idly by. What actions could she possibly take? Would the police even heed the concerns of an elderly woman with no tangible evidence beyond her own vigilant observations? Her neighbors had certainly not taken her seriously. As dawn bathed Brookvale in a soft light, Miriam resolved to take matters into her own hands. She decided to follow James and gather concrete evidence, and then, armed with this, she would ensure that someone listened. The following evening, as James's car slid out of the garage punctually, Miriam was prepared. With her coat on and keys in hand, she stealthily exited her home as soon as the garage door shut behind James and Amara. Her heart thudded as she ignited her old sedan's engine, feeling like a character from the mystery novels she cherished. For several nights, Miriam discreetly trailed James and Amara after they left the garage. Clutching the steering wheel, her hands trembled as she maintained a cautious distance, careful to avoid detection. Their routine appeared frustratingly normal. They would visit a nearby park, sit on a bench, and sometimes enjoy ice cream from a local vendor before returning to the garage. The interactions, or lack thereof, between James and Amara struck Miriam the most. They rarely spoke, and when they did, it seemed forced and awkward. Amara often appeared sad and distant, while James seemed perpetually on edge, his eyes constantly darting around as if expecting danger. One evening, as Miriam observed them from her car parked across the street from the park, she witnessed something that sent chills down her spine. James and Amara were seated on their usual bench, the little girl listlessly swinging her legs, when suddenly James tensed, stood up abruptly, and hurried Amara back to the car. Miriam's pulse quickened as she watched them hastily depart. What had alarmed James so suddenly? What was he fleeing from? These questions whirled in Miriam's mind, adding to the mounting mysteries surrounding the pair. As she drove home that night, following them back to the garage, a storm of emotions churned within her. Fear for Amara, fear of what she might discover, and fear of being mistaken and ridiculed. Yet, a somber determination prevailed. She was too deeply involved to back down now. Whatever the truth, she was determined to uncover it. Back at her house, Miriam sat by her window, watching as the lights in the garage eventually extinguished. She pondered over Amara's situation, the young girl trying to find rest in that cold, damp space. No child deserved such conditions, Miriam thought. Whatever James Harlow was entangled in, Amara deserved better. As she prepared for bed in the early morning hours, Miriam silently vowed to herself, to Amara, and even to James, that she would unravel this mystery, no matter the cost. Little did she know how soon her resolve would be tested, and how dramatically it would alter not only her life, but also the lives of everyone in Brookvale. As October yielded to November, the trees along Maple Street, once ablaze with reds and golds, now stood mostly bare, their skeletal branches clawing at a steel-grey sky. Pulling her cardigan tighter, Miriam settled into her usual vigil by the window, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands. Tonight, however, the atmosphere was charged with a palpable tension, an anticipation she couldn't quite ignore. As the streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the pavement, an unusual sight caught her eye. A sleek, black luxury car cruised down the street, its polished surface stark against the dimming light. It slowed as it approached the neglected garage, and Miriam leaned forward, her breath fogging the cold glass. This was a new development. In all the months of her watch, she had never seen another visitor at the garage. Her heart raced as she observed the details of the vehicle, far too opulent for their modest neighborhood. The car halted directly in front of the garage, and for a moment all was still. Then the driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, his presence radiating wealth and authority. His dark, impeccably tailored suit spoke of boardrooms and significant negotiations. He moved with the assurance of someone accustomed to command. As if on cue, the garage door creaked open, and James appeared, his once crisp suit now noticeably disheveled. The stark contrast between the two men was evident, and Miriam felt a pang of sympathy for James despite her suspicions. The visitor initiated the conversation, his agitation evident even at a distance, gesturing emphatically as he spoke. James, in response, seemed to be attempting to pacify the man, his posture defensive, his hands raised in a placating manner. Their discussion was brief, but to Miriam it seemed to stretch for an eternity. She strained to catch even a fragment of their conversation, but the words eluded her, lost to the distance between them. The whisper of wind through the bare trees echoed as the visitor finally seemed to have stated his point. He jabbed a finger in James's face, a gesture that was unmistakably threatening, before spinning on his heel and striding back to his car. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle quickly sped off, leaving James standing alone in front of the garage. Miriam watched, her breath fogging up the window, as James stood motionless for several moments, his shoulders slumped and his head bowed, looking, Miriam thought, like a man burdened by the weight of the world. Then, slowly, James turned and walked back into the garage, the door creaking shut behind him, and silence once again fell over Maple Street. Miriam leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. What had she just seen? Who was that man, and what did he want with James? The encounter had been brief but intense, and it was clear that whatever was happening, it was serious. As she replayed the scene in her mind, Miriam's suspicions began to solidify into something more definite. This was no simple case of a man and a young girl living under unusual circumstances. Something much larger and possibly dangerous was unfolding. The rest of the night passed in a whirl of racing thoughts and half-formed theories. Miriam barely slept, her dreams haunted by shadowy figures and muffled conversations. She woke the next morning more exhausted than when she had gone to bed, but more determined than ever. As she moved through her morning routine, making her bed, brewing strong coffee, and picking at a piece of toast she had no appetite for, Miriam tried to piece together everything she knew. James Harrow, once a wealthy and respected businessman now living in an abandoned garage with a young girl, the mysterious nighttime visitor clearly angry about something, the tense encounters in the park, the constant vigilance, the air of secrecy that surrounded everything James did, it all pointed to something significant, but what? Miriam couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing a key piece of the puzzle, something crucial that would make everything clear. As she washed her breakfast dishes, staring out at the quiet street beyond her kitchen window, she made a decision. She had been watching from afar for too long. If she wanted real answers, she would need to take a more active approach. The thought sent a shiver of fear through her. What if she was wrong? What if, as her neighbors suggested, she was just a lonely old woman imagining conspiracies where none existed? Or worse, what if she was right, and by interfering she put herself or Amara in danger. But then she thought of Amara's sad eyes, James's slumped shoulders, the threatening gesture of the mysterious visitor. Whatever was happening, it wasn't right, and if no one else was going to do anything about it, then it fell to her. Miriam dried her hands on a dish towel, her resolve hardening. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do yet, but she knew she had to do something. As she looked out at the garage, silent and innocuous in the pale morning light, she made a silent vow. "I'm going to find out the truth," she whispered to herself, "for Amara's sake and for James's too, whatever it takes." Little did Miriam know that her chance to uncover the truth would come sooner than she expected, and in a way she could never have anticipated. The events set in motion by the mysterious visitor's appearance were about to come to a head, and Miriam would find herself at the center of a revelation that would shake Brookvale to its core. The days following the mysterious visitor's appearance passed in a haze of heightened vigilance for Miriam. Her nightly observations took on new intensity, her eyes straining in the darkness for any sign of further unusual activity around the garage. Yet nights came and went without incident, the routine of James and Amara's arrivals and departures as regular as clockwork. But something had changed. Miriam could sense it in the air, a tension that seemed to radiate from the old garage at the end of the street. She noticed it in the way James's movements seemed more hurried, his glances over his shoulder more frequent. Even Amara, usually stoic and quiet, seemed to have picked up on the shift, her small hand clinging tighter to James's as they made their way from car to garage each evening. Driven by a mix of concern and an almost obsessive need to uncover the truth, Miriam decided to take her surveillance a step further. On a particularly cold November evening, she bundled up in her warmest coat, pulled on a pair of sturdy walking shoes, and set out to follow James and Amara on foot. Her heart pounded as she slipped out of her house, staying close to the shadows cast by the bare trees lining the street. She felt equal parts ridiculous and exhilarated, a 72-year-old woman playing at being a detective. But the memory of the mysterious visitor's threatening gesture steeled her resolve. As James's car pulled out of the garage, Miriam hurried to follow, keeping to the sidewalk and trying her best to look like nothing more than an old woman out for an evening stroll. She tracked them to the local park, the same one she'd observed them visiting before. From behind a large oak tree, Miriam watched as James and Amara settled onto a bench. The park was nearly deserted at this hour, the play equipment standing silent and ghostly in the glow of the streetlights. James and Amara sat in what appeared to be uncomfortable silence, neither speaking nor making eye contact. Miriam strained to hear any conversation, but the only sounds were the rustle of dead leaves in the chilly breeze and the distant hum of traffic. As she watched, she noticed something that made her heart clench. Amara, her bright yellow dress now visibly worn and slightly too small, was shivering in the cold night air. Without a word, James shrugged off his suit jacket, the same one he'd been wearing for months now, Miriam realized, and draped it over Amara's small shoulders. The gesture was so tender, so paternal, that for a moment Miriam felt a pang of doubt about her suspicions. Could she have misjudged the situation so badly? But then she remembered the mysterious visitor, the heated exchange, the fear she'd seen in James's eyes. No, there was definitely more to this story than met the eye. As if to confirm her thoughts, the silence between James and Amara was suddenly broken. Miriam couldn't make out the words, but the sudden shift in their dynamic was unmistakable. Amara's voice rose in apparent distress, drawing a low and urgent reply from James. Miriam, driven by a desperate need to understand, edged closer to catch their exchange. "We can't keep doing this, Amara," floated James's voice on the breeze, tinged with urgency. "It's not safe anymore." Although Amara's reply was too soft for Miriam to discern, the vigorous shake of her head and her tight grip on James's arm were unmistakable. "I know, sweetheart," James replied, his voice heavy with emotion. "I know it's hard, but we might not have a choice." Their conversation then dropped to a murmur, frustratingly inaudible to Miriam, leaving her with more questions than answers. What was no longer safe? What choice were they facing? These snippets of conversation deepened the enigma, compelling Miriam's thoughts into overdrive. Unaware of a lurking twig underfoot, Miriam inadvertently snapped it, the sound slicing through the park's stillness like a gunshot. James immediately turned, his eyes scanning the darkness. Miriam's heart raced. She pressed against the tree, barely breathing. For a long, tense moment, James's gaze seemed to pierce through the dark directly towards her. Then, with a sudden motion, he stood, took Amara's hand, and with a tone laced with barely controlled fear, urged, "Come on, we need to go now." Miriam observed, pulse pounding, as they quickly left the park. She waited, leaning against the tree, weakened by the encounter, yet more convinced than ever that something deeply troubling was unfolding. As she walked home, her mind reeled with the snippets of conversation she had captured. "It's not safe anymore. We might not have a choice." What did it all mean? By the time she reached her home, she was both breathless and trembling, not just from physical exertion, but from the emotional toll of the night's revelations. She collapsed into her favorite armchair, her gaze automatically drawn to the garage at the street's end, which sat silent and enigmatic, offering no clues. Sleep eluded Miriam that night. She tossed and turned, haunted by shadowy figures and muffled voices in her dreams. Waking the next morning, she felt drained but was imbued with a renewed determination to unravel the mystery. As days passed, Miriam's anxiety intensified. Small noises startled her, and her nerves were frayed by her constant state of alert. Her neighbors, already skeptical of her fixation with James and Amara, began to steer clear of her, but Miriam barely registered their avoidance, so consumed was she with the goings-on at the end of the street. About a week after her furtive park visit, Miriam was startled from her vigil by an unfamiliar sound, raised voices emanating from the garage. Heart racing, she pressed her face against the window, peering through the gathering dusk. The garage door was ajar, casting a sliver of yellow light onto the street. There, in that beam of light, were James and Amara. Even from a distance, Miriam could see Amara crying, her body shaking with sobs. James was kneeling before her, hands on her shoulders, speaking with urgency. Compelled by the intensity of the scene, Miriam didn't hesitate. She grabbed her coat and hurried towards the garage, driven to get closer to hear more clearly. As she approached, Amara's sobs and fragments of James's frustrated and desperate tones reached her. "We can't stay here any more, Amara," she heard him say. "It's not safe. They know where we are." Amara's wails grew louder. "But I don't want to leave. This is our home now. Why can't we just stay?" James's response was too low to hear, but it only intensified Amara's distress. Miriam was so engrossed in their conversation that she failed to notice a loose paving stone. Her foot caught, and she stumbled, letting out a startled yelp. The voices abruptly ceased. James appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from fear to anger as he spotted Miriam. They stared at each other, the tension palpable, only broken by Amara's continuing sobs from inside. "You," James accused, his voice low and threatening. "You're the one who's been watching us." A chill ran down Miriam's spine. This was not the James she remembered, the community benefactor, but a man cornered, desperate. I was just concerned," Miriam stammered, stepping back. "The little girl. I thought." "You thought what?" James stepped toward her, his tone demanding. "That you'd play detective? That you'd uncover some big secret?" Miriam's words failed her. All her prepared defenses crumbled under his scrutiny. "I'm sorry," she finally murmured. "I didn't mean to. I was just worried about the child." At the mention of Amara, James's demeanor softened slightly, his anger giving way to a profound weariness. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he whispered, a trace of despair in his voice. No idea at all. A car turned onto the street, its headlights slicing through the darkness, prompting James to react. Go home, he urged Miriam, his tone now urgent. Go home and forget what you've seen, for your own safety and for Amara's. With that, he retreated into the garage, closing the door firmly behind him. Miriam stood momentarily frozen, then hurried home, shaken by the confrontation. Once inside, she leaned against the door, her heart pounding, the weight of James's words, and her own actions, pressing heavily upon her. But this revelation only cemented her worst fears. Whatever James and Amara were entangled in, it was undoubtedly grave and possibly perilous. As she headed to her bedroom, Miriam's decision was firm. Tomorrow she would approach the police. She needed to share what she had witnessed and heard, for Amara's and James's sakes. She could no longer keep this to herself. Unbeknownst to Miriam, however, the wheels of fate were already turning, setting the stage for a disclosure that would unfold in ways she never anticipated. That night she fell into an uneasy sleep, while a critical confrontation loomed on the horizon, one that would alter everything. As the morning dawned, shrouded in a grey, misty veil, Miriam awoke early, her rest disturbed by disquieting dreams. The weight of the previous night's events pressed heavily on her as she mechanically went about her morning routine, preparing a breakfast she couldn't bring herself to eat. As she sipped her tea, gazing out at the still street, her resolve solidified. She planned to head to the police station as soon as it opened, determined to relay everything she had observed over the past few months. Surely, she thought, the police would take action and delve into the matter. Now, it was out of her hands. But just as she was about to rinse her cup, a movement outside caught her eye. James's car was pulling out of the garage unusually early. Miriam pressed her face closer to the window, sensing something amiss. The car moved slowly, hesitantly, as if its driver was uncertain of his destination. Without a second thought, Miriam grabbed her coat and keys. She couldn't let them leave, not before she had spoken to the police. She had to do something to delay them until she could get help. Her heart pounding, Miriam rushed out of her house and down the street. James's car had barely reached the block's end, crawling along. As she drew closer, she could see James behind the wheel, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel tightly. Beside him, Amara's small face was visible, her eyes wide with fear. "Wait," Miriam called out, her voice cracking. "Please wait." James's head snapped around at her voice, and Miriam glimpsed naked panic in his eyes. Then, to her surprise, the car slowed to a stop. James sat for a long moment, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Then slowly he opened the door and stepped out. "Mrs. Watson," he addressed her, his voice weary, "I thought I told you to stay out of this." Miriam approached cautiously, her hands held up in a placating gesture. "Mr. Harrow, James," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I know you think you're protecting Amara, but this isn't right. Living in that garage, always hiding, it's no life for a child." James's face twisted with a mix of anger and despair. "You don't understand," he replied, his voice low and intense. "You have no idea what's really going on." "Then tell me," Miriam implored. "Help me understand. From where I'm standing, it looks like you're in some kind of trouble, and that little girl is caught right in the middle of it." James remained silent for a long moment, the morning mist swirling around him. He appeared more lost and alone than Miriam had ever seen anyone. Then, almost imperceptibly, something in him seemed to give way. "You're right," he conceded softly, his voice a mere whisper. "We are in trouble, but it's not what you think." Miriam stepped closer, her heart pounding. "What is it, then?" she asked gently. "Please, James, let me help." James regarded her for a long moment, as if weighing whether to confide in her. Finally, with a deep sigh, He began to reveal his story. "I used to be wealthy," he started, his gaze distant. "I had everything. The mansion, the cars, a successful business. But then it all changed. The market crashed, bad investments, a series of poor decisions. I lost everything." Miriam listened intently, her eyes wide in surprise. This was far from what she had anticipated. "I couldn't bear the shame," James continued, his voice a whisper. "The thought of everyone knowing, seeing their pity. So, I ran. I took Amara and what little money I had left, and we disappeared." "But why here?" Miriam asked, gesturing towards the garage. "Why live like this?" James's face was a picture of despair and resignation. "Where else could we go? I had no money for rent, no job prospects. This garage was the only place I could think of where we might be safe, where we could stay hidden until I figured out what to do next." Miriam's heart ached as she absorbed his words. All her fears and suspicions, it turned out, had been grounded in a reality much simpler and yet profoundly sadder than she had imagined. But the man who visited, she recalled, that tense encounter I witnessed, who was he? James's expression darkened. "A creditor," he responded bitterly. "One of many. They've been hunting me, demanding money I don't have. That's why we have to leave. They've found us, and it's not safe anymore." Compassion washed over Miriam as she looked past James to where Amara sat in the car, her eyes wide and frightened. The little girl had indeed been in danger, albeit not of the kind Miriam had suspected. "Oh, James," she said softly, her voice laden with sympathy, "why didn't you ask for help? There are people here who would have understood." James shook his head, tears glistening in his eyes. "I couldn't," he choked out, his voice laden with emotion. "I was too proud, too ashamed. And now, it's too late." But Miriam, her resolve strengthening, shook her head firmly. "It's not too late," she insisted. "James, listen to me. You don't have to run any more. Let me help you." Hope and doubt warred in James's eyes. "How?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Miriam straightened, feeling a certainty she hadn't felt in months. "First," she declared, "you and Amara are coming to stay with me. No arguments. We'll figure out how to deal with these creditors, how to get you back on your feet. And we'll do it discreetly." James stared at her, disbelief mingled with a desperate hope. "You'd do that for us?" he whispered, astounded. Miriam nodded firmly. "Sometimes," she said, "we find family in the most unexpected places. Now come on, let's get you and Amara settled. We have a lot of work to do." "But we'll do it together." James hesitated just briefly before nodding. As they walked toward Miriam's house with Amara trailing behind, Miriam felt a renewed sense of purpose envelop her. The mystery had been resolved, yet in many ways their journey was just beginning. The walk to Miriam's house passed in silence, each absorbed in their thoughts. Approaching the front door, Miriam noted how James's steps slowed, a sign of his grappling with a new reality sinking in. "It's all right," Miriam reassured softly, placing a hand on his arm. "You're safe here." James nodded, swallowing hard, his voice laden with emotion. "Thank you," he murmured. As Miriam ushered them into the warmth of her home, she marveled at the swift change in her life. Just that morning, she had been entangled in suspicion and fear, and now she was welcoming the very people she had been observing into her home. Once they settled Amara in the spare bedroom, James requested a moment to speak with Miriam alone. They retreated to the kitchen, where James's demeanor turned serious. "Miriam," he began, his voice low, "I can't thank you enough for your help. But there's something important I need to ask." Miriam nodded, sensing his hesitance. "Of course, James. What is it?" James glanced toward the bedroom to make sure Amara couldn't hear. I'd appreciate it if we could keep our situation private for now. The debt collectors. I'd rather they didn't know exactly where we are. It's not dangerous, but I'd like to keep a low profile while I sort things out. Miriam's brow furrowed slightly. I understand, James. Is there anything else I should be aware of? He shook his head. No, it's just about giving us some breathing room. Can you help us with this, Miriam? At least until we get back on our feet. Miriam offered a reassuring smile. Of course, James. Your privacy is safe with me. Relief washed over James's features. Thank you, he said quietly. It means more than you know. As days passed, they settled into a quiet routine that brought new life to Miriam's once solitary home. James moved with a mix of gratitude and worry, his recent troubles still shadowing his demeanor. Often, Miriam found him on the back porch, deep in thought. One evening, joining him with a mug of tea, she broke the comfortable silence. The sunset seems to have you deep in thought, she observed softly. Mind sharing what's on your mind? James traced the rim of his mug, his voice soft. I keep thinking about how different things might have been if I had faced my problems head-on instead of running. Miriam nodded understandingly. We all make mistakes, James. What matters is how we learn from them. You're taking steps in the right direction now. She then added warmly, You know, I remember all the good you've done for this community, your charitable work, the people you've helped. Offering you a safe place now, it's the least I could do. A small smile appeared on James's face, tinged with both gratitude and regret. I never thought I'd be on the receiving end of charity, but I'm grateful for your kindness, Miriam, and your discretion. Miriam chuckled softly. Well, every neighborhood needs someone keeping an eye out, I suppose, even if it's to help those who've always been the helpers. As twilight deepened, a sense of peace settled over Miriam. The mystery was solved, but their journey was far from over. Challenges lay ahead in rebuilding James's life, ensuring Amara's well-being, and dealing with financial issues. Yet, for the first time in months, there was a glimmer of hope. From inside, Amara's soft humming drifted out to them, a gentle reminder of the new life taking root in Miriam's home.